Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we begin one of the greatest and most humane works of world literature, a vast epic of guilt and grace, of poverty and dignity, of a man who seeks a new life and is hunted for it all his days. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo, published in the year 1862. We follow the former convict Jean Valjean through the France of the 19th century, through misery and redemption, flight and sacrifice. It is a story of how goodness can be stronger than any law. Make yourself comfortable, let go of the day, and come along. In the year 1815, a man came on foot into the little town of Digne, dusty, weary, and of forbidding appearance. It was Jean Valjean, and he carried with him the yellow passport of a released convict. 19 years he had spent in the penal colony, on the galleys and in chains. It had all begun with a single deed. In bitter need to feed the starving children of his widowed sister, he had stolen a loaf of bread. For this he had been sentenced to 5 years, and his repeated attempts at escape had swelled the sentence to 19 years. When at last he was released, the once good-natured man had become a hardened, embittered creature, full of resentment against a society that had punished him so harshly. In Digne, he sought a place to spend the night, but everywhere he was turned away, for his yellow passport betrayed who he was. No inn, no house, not even a dog's kennel would take him in. Exhausted and despairing, he knocked at last at the door of the Bishop of Digne, an old man named Myriel, who was known throughout the land for his goodness and humility. The bishop received the stranger without hesitation, called him not convict, but brother, set food before him, and granted him a bed. But in the night, the old resentment and the old habit awoke in Valjean. He stole the bishop's silver tableware and fled into the darkness. The next morning, gendarmes brought him back, for they had seized the suspicious man with the silver. But what happened now changed Valjean's life forever. The bishop stepped forward and declared to the gendarmes that he had given Valjean the silver as a gift, and more than that, he took 2 silver candlesticks and handed them to the astonished man with the words that he had, after all, forgotten to take these as well. When the gendarmes had gone, the bishop said to him softly that he should use this silver to become an honest man, for he had now wrested his soul from evil and consecrated it to good. Shaken and inwardly in turmoil, Valjean left the town, and within him there began a struggle that was to shape the whole of his further life. From that hour on, Jean Valjean was a different man. And yet his transformation was at first not firmly settled. For shortly after he had left Digne, still caught in his old hardness, he met a small boy, a Savoyard named Petit Gervais, who dropped a coin to the ground. Out of old coarse habit, Valjean set his foot upon it and kept the coin. And only when the boy had run off weeping did he wake as from an evil dream and grasp with horror what he had done. In vain he searched for the little one, but he was long gone. In that hour, the transformation the bishop had set in motion broke through once and for all, and Valjean vowed, in tears, to become another man from then on. But the deed had consequences, for the theft from the child made him a relapsed criminal, who, after a fresh offense, had to disappear again. And so, from then on, he was wanted as a fugitive repeat offender. For this very reason, he could not begin an honest life under his own name. When, years later, a stranger appeared in the town of Montreuil-sur-Mer, who introduced a new method in a branch of manufacture and brought the whole town to prosperity, he therefore called himself Madeleine, and hid his true origin behind this foreign name. No one suspected that the kindly manufacturer, whom the town soon appointed mayor, was in truth the wanted Jean Valjean, who now led an honest life under a new name and redeemed the bishop's teaching with every deed. But the happiness and peace of this life stood on shifting ground. In the town there lived a police inspector named Javert, a man of iron devotion to duty and unrelenting severity, for whom the law stood above all and who knew no mercy and no exception. Javert had once been a warder in the penal colony, and he carried within him a dark suspicion that he knew the mayor from somewhere. At the same time, there lived in Montreuil a young woman named Fantine, who belonged to the poorest of the town. In her youth she had been seduced and then abandoned by a careless young man, and from this bond she had a little girl, Cosette. To find work and to hide the stain of an illegitimate child, Fantine had left her daughter along the way in the care of an innkeeper couple, the Thénardiers, and paid them regularly for her keep. She did not suspect that the Thénardiers were cruel, greedy people who treated the child badly, dressed her in rags, and made her toil, while they extorted ever higher sums from Fantine. Fantine worked in Madeleine's factory, but when it came out that she had an illegitimate child, she was dismissed, without Madeleine himself knowing of it. From then on, things went downhill for her. She sold her hair, she sold everything she owned, and fell into ever deeper need, only to be able to meet the Thénardiers' demands, until in the end, no way out remained to her but to cast herself away and earn her bread on the street. One day, Fantine became caught up in a quarrel on the street and was arrested by Javert, who meant to throw her into prison. But the Mayor Madeleine intervened. He had meanwhile learned what grave wrong had been done to this woman in his factory, and he took her under his care, set her free, and promised to provide for her and her child. Fantine was by this time already gravely ill, worn down by need and sorrow, and Madeleine had her placed in a hospital and vowed to bring her daughter Cosette to her. But at the same time, an event occurred that placed Valjean before the hardest trial of his conscience. Javert came to him and reported that a man named Champmathieu had been arrested, who was taken for the long-sought escaped convict, Jean Valjean. This innocent man was now to be brought to court and condemned in Valjean's place. For Valjean, this meant a terrible choice. If he kept silent, he remained free and could go on doing good, but an innocent man would go to the penal colony for him. If he confessed, he lost everything: his freedom, his standing, his ability to help. After a night of terrible inner struggle, his conscience prevailed. Valjean traveled to the court, stepped before the bar, and made himself known as the true Jean Valjean, and thereby saved the innocent Champmathieu while he delivered himself up to persecution. He hurried back to Fantine, but there Javert already awaited him, to arrest him. Fantine, who had to watch from her sickbed as the man who had been her only hope was unmasked and seized as a convict, suffered a fatal shock and died, without ever having seen her daughter again. Valjean was led away, but the promise he had given the dying Fantine to provide for her Cosette burned within him. He escaped custody once more by feigning his death, and from then on his life had only one aim: to free the child from the hands of the Thénardiers. True to his promise to the dying Fantine, Valjean set out for Montfermeil, where the Thénardiers kept their inn and held little Cosette in their power. He found the child on a winter evening, when she had been sent out into the darkness to fetch water from the distant spring, a bucket far too heavy for so small and worn a girl. Cosette had become a shy, frightened creature, dressed in rags, barefoot, overworked, and treated without love, while the Thénardiers pampered their own daughters. Valjean took the heavy bucket from the child and walked her back. In the inn he saw with his own eyes how the girl was tormented, and his resolve stood firm. He negotiated with the greedy innkeepers who gave Cosette up only reluctantly and for a high sum, for they had seen in the child a steady source of money. At last Valjean paid what they demanded, took Cosette by the hand, and led her away from that house of misery. For the child, a new life thus began. In Valjean, Cosette found, for the first time, a person who was kind to her, who protected her and loved her like a father. And in the lonely, hunted man, this child awakened a tenderness and a purpose in life that he had never known. The two became everything to each other, a father and a daughter, not by blood, yet by the heart all the more deeply. They traveled to Paris, where Valjean hoped to disappear in the great city and lead a quiet life unrecognized. But his peace did not last long. For the relentless Javert, who had seen through Valjean's feigned death, had meanwhile been transferred to Paris as a police officer, and like a hound, he took up the trail of his old adversary again. One evening, Valjean escaped discovery by only a hair's breadth when he recognized Javert in the nighttime streets. With Cosette by the hand, he fled through dark Paris, pursued and in the greatest danger, until in his need he saved himself over a wall and found himself all at once in the garden of a convent. The convent, into whose garden Valjean had fled, was to become a saving refuge for him and Cosette. By a happy chance, Valjean met there a man whose life he had saved in earlier days as mayor, an old gardener named Fauchelevent. He recognized his former benefactor and was ready, out of gratitude, to help him. And so it came about that Valjean was henceforth allowed to work and live as the gardener's assistant in the convent, while Cosette was taken into the convent school and educated. Behind the quiet walls, far from the world and from Javert's pursuit, the two spent some peaceful years. Cosette grew up sheltered, and Valjean found a peace such as he had long not known. But time passed, and Cosette became a young woman. Valjean understood that he could not keep the girl forever in the seclusion of the convent, that she had a right to life and to the world. And so the two at last left the sheltering walls and moved into a quiet house in Paris, where Valjean lived under a false name as a retiring, well-to-do man who did good in secret and helped the poor. Around the same time, elsewhere in Paris, there grew up a young man who was to enter this story, Marius Pontmercy. He was the son of a colonel who had once served under Napoleon, and he grew up with his grandfather, a stern, old-minded gentleman of royalist conviction. Between the grandfather and the late father, a deep political enmity had prevailed, and only after the father's death did Marius learn the truth about him and begin to revere his memory ardently. Over their political differences, Marius fell out with his grandfather and left his house, to live from then on in poverty and independence as a young student. He joined a circle of young, idealistic men who dreamed of freedom and a more just society, and lived out his convictions modestly and alone. One day, during one of his walks in a public garden of Paris, Marius caught sight of a young girl at the side of an older gentleman, and this sight changed his life. It was Cosette in Valjean's company. Marius fell in love at first sight, and Cosette too noticed the young man who met her day after day, and in her heart the same feeling awoke. But for a long time the two did not dare to speak with each other, and only exchanged shy glances. Valjean, however, to whom the young man's growing attention did not escape, became uneasy, and from then on avoided the garden, so that the two lovers lost sight of each other. Marius was in despair, for he knew neither the girl's name nor where she lived. Only after long searching and with some effort did he manage to find out Cosette's dwelling. Soon the two found each other. They secretly confessed their love, and met furtively in the garden of the house where Cosette lived with Valjean, without his at first suspecting anything of it. For the young people, it was a time of pure, blissful happiness. But over this happiness, dark clouds were gathering. Valjean, ever on his guard, sensed that his safety was threatened. He had noticed signs that he was being followed, and at the same time the political unrest in Paris was growing, which brought with it a sharper attention from the police, and that always meant danger for him. Out of fear of being discovered, Valjean formed the resolve to leave France with Cosette and to flee to England. When Cosette revealed to Marius at a secret meeting that she must soon go away and leave him, a world collapsed for the young man. In his despair at losing the beloved girl and seeing no way out, Marius formed a dark resolve about his further fate, which now joined itself to the stormy events that shook Paris in those days. Marius, who without Cosette saw no more meaning in life, turned in his despair to the friends with whom he had dreamed of a better, more just world. In those June days of the year 1832, an uprising broke out in Paris, born by young Republicans who rose up against the existing order. In the narrow lanes of the city, they built barricades of paving stones, overturned carts, and everything that could be piled up, and entrenched themselves behind them, resolved to fight for their convictions and, if it must be, to die. Marius, with a broken heart and without hope, joined them and went to the barricade, more to seek death than out of any lust for battle. Among the insurgents there was also a brave Paris street boy named Gavroche, a bright, courageous little fellow who without fear played his pranks in the midst of the hail of bullets and helped the fighters. Javert, too, was present, yet not as a fighter, but as a spy. The insurgents had unmasked him as a police informer who had mingled among them and had taken him prisoner and bound him. But Valjean had learned through an intercepted letter that Marius, the young man whom Cosette loved, was at the barricade and hovered there in mortal danger. And although this Marius threatened to take his beloved Cosette from him, Valjean formed a resolve that matched the whole greatness of his soul. He went himself to the barricade, into the very midst of the fighting and the danger, solely for Cosette's sake, to save the beloved of her heart. There at the barricade he came upon the bound Javert, his relentless pursuer, who was now in the power of the insurgents and faced death. The prisoner was handed over to Valjean, and he could now have rid himself of his lifelong adversary at a stroke. But Valjean, in whom no hatred lived, led Javert aside, loosened his bonds, and set him free without doing him any harm, and gave him his liberty, though he knew that this man would go on pursuing him. When the uprising was crushed and the barricade fell, most of the young fighters lay dead in the lanes, among them the brave Gavroche. Marius, gravely wounded and unconscious, would likewise have perished had Valjean not carried him off on his shoulders. There began one of the most famous passages of the story. Valjean fled with the senseless Marius through the dark, far-branching sewers of Paris for hours, exhausted, through mud and darkness, until at last he reached an exit. But there stood Javert. Yet the inspector did not do what Valjean had expected. He saw the man who had given him his life at the barricade, and he saw how this hunted man, at great sacrifice, was saving a wounded one. In Javert something broke. All his life he had believed in the law, in the clear order of right and wrong, of criminal and honest man. But now there stood before him a convict who acted more kindly and more nobly than any respectable man. And Javert could not bear this contradiction. He let Valjean go, but the shattering of his innermost view of the world broke him. Unable to go on living with this new knowledge, in which his rigid thinking found no place anymore, Javert took his own life that night by going into the Seine. Valjean brought the wounded Marius to his grandfather, where the young man slowly recovered. After his healing, Marius and Cosette married, and nothing seemed to stand in the way of the young happiness anymore. But Valjean, out of conscientiousness and because he did not wish to burden the pure happiness of the two with the shadow of his past, revealed to Marius that he was a former convict. Marius, who did not yet know the true greatness of this man, thereupon withdrew from him and kept him away from Cosette. And so it came about that Valjean, who had lived for Cosette and given everything for her, now spent his last days lonely and separated from her. Without the person who had been his whole reason for living, his strength left him, and he began to waste away. But in the end, the truth came to light. Marius learned that it had been none other than Valjean who had carried him through the sewers at the risk of his life and saved him, and that this man had devoted his whole existence to goodness and to sacrifice. Full of remorse and reverence, he hurried with Cosette to Valjean, but they came just in time to find him dying. In his last moments, surrounded by the two people he loved, by Cosette, whom he had raised like a daughter, and by Marius, who now understood him, Jean Valjean found peace at last. Reconciled with himself and the world, in the light of the love he had sown and reaped, he closed his eyes and died quietly, a just man at the end of a long and hard road. That was our short retelling of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo, a story of guilt and grace, of persecution and sacrifice, and of a man who proved that goodness and humanity can be stronger than any law. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow, here at Sleepy Classic Tales.